So can you just start out and kind of tell us a little bit about yourself and kind of how you started out in financial services and what drew you to kind of working with employee benefits?
Sure. I started out in employee benefits really just as a participant in a 403B plan when I was right out of college. I was a psych major and I worked with juvenile delinquents in New York City. And I remember sitting through a meeting and having no idea what the person in front of me was talking about, and also realizing the pressure that I was under at that limited salary living in the New York City area, and having no idea how I'd get from being that 22-year-old youth counselor to somebody that someday could retire. Mm-hmm. Due to that income level, I decided to move over to employee benefits, specialized in working with nonprofits, and through the years specialized more and more on the retirement side, and ended up running a large distribution client management organization. And what brought me to where I am today is I noticed there was an extreme disconnect between HR working with employees prioritizing retirement and the CFO not really understanding the impact that the financial wellness of their employees would ultimately have on that employer's financial statement. And that ultimately brought me into a sabbatical mode where I went out and interviewed CFOs to help them and to help me understand their lack of interest or prioritization on the retirement plan. And then I went about creating the math necessary for them to understand why the alignment between what's good for that employee's financial wellness and how that ties right into the future viability of that employer.
Yeah, that's a kind of crazy jump from working with juvenile delinquents to what you do today, I guess.
Yeah. It has its own twisted logic, but I would put that under God makes straight with crooked lines. You know?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure a lot of people and, employees feel the same way that you felt about not understanding how they're going to get to retirement with, when they first start out in their career. So that makes total sense.
Right.
So can you just kind of tell us more about, what you're doing with Viability Advisory Group and what your primary focus has been with them?
Yeah, so Viability Advisory Group is the little firm that I created back in July of 2014 based on the fact that I wanted to create this alignment between the CFO, understanding how retirement affects their financial statement, and also aligning that with what's in the best interest of the employee. And very simply, I looked at our industry and I realized that great advisory firms were doing a really good job identifying how to make employees financially well. A lot of it using behavioral finance around plan design or different techniques around investments. And what I wanted to do is not try to be redundant with what good advisors were doing or good retirement providers did with the advisor community, but instead start with identifying the potential liability to an employer of having employees that would like to separate from service at retirement age, but were financially trapped by their lack of financial wellness, and what was the financial impact from a wage, healthcare, workers' comp perspective, and how that was coming back to the financial statement of the employer. So it really was to tee up there is a liability, and then to take the techniques that the advisor would normally recommend and prove out that those techniques would actually mitigate that liability for the employer. So that CFO sitting in a meeting would understand not only that this technique is good for the employee, but that they understand that over the long term, that actually will make the cost of wage, healthcare, workers' comp go down in their financial statement.
financial wellness is something that AFS really supports, and,
Sure.
We kind of promote that to our clients as well. And, I feel like one of the main questions we get a lot is sort of like, how do you measure the return on investment? So,
Right.
this is the answer to that, basically.
Yeah, so this really came out of me sitting in a lot of finals meetings and seeing the CFO genuinely disinterested in the conversation until we got to the fee that the advisor or provider was going to charge for the funds that were going to be offered in the plan.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to make sure that very clearly the cost-benefit analysis or the return on investment of each technique could be identified so that we could take more progressive action in making Americans financially well.
Yeah. So kind of how do you, I assume, you're using a lot of fancy data and like numbers and everything. How do you kind of break that down for people who aren't really as well versed in that as you are, since, you are doing it every day? How do you kind of
Sure.
approach that with retirement committees or benefits, whoever you're talking to?
Yeah, so I work with the client's advisor. We collect their data. So the most important thing that CFOs made clear to me is that they don't really buy into studies or looking at somebody else's numbers for their return on investment. So the first thing we do is we collect their data hire, date of birth, deferral rates, plan design, account balance. We integrate that all into Social Security so that any liability that we're potentially identifying is very specific to that employer's wage, health care, and workers' comp scenario.
Mm-hmm.
And then we take those techniques, and basically the techniques, if you think about it, the only two things that make a difference in a retirement plan, whether that's a defined benefit plan or a defined contribution plan, such as a 401k, 403b, or a 457 plan, the only two techniques that make a difference are you actually change the level of funding or you actually change the investment scenario. Those are the only two things that actually mitigate liability. So piece by piece, we actually test out any proposed change in funding or investments and prove what would be the change in potential liability.
Mm-hmm.
But the most important thing that you raised in your question was we make sure that we're actually using that client's data so that HR and the CFO know that the scenario is specific to them.
Yeah, so you're not just using some general study or anything like that you did for, multiple employers, multiple types of companies, nothing like that. It's very targeted.
Yeah, what we did is in my prior life, we actually did what was called the CFO story, and we used a lot of studies and a lot of general numbers. And what we found is the CFO story that we created really worked with HR, but got absolutely no engagement from the CFO. So that's when we realized, or I realized when I took my sabbatical and built this new little company,
Mm-hmm.
we actually had to build a model that could use that company's actual numbers.
Yeah. And so you used to work with MassMutual, and then you started Viability, and now Viability is part of MassMutual, correct?
Correct.
So how does kind of having those larger resources, I assume, with MassMutual, kind of, how has that enhanced or changed kind of your work?
Yeah, so my mission is to change the center point of the decision-making process. So as a 3 or 4 person company, your reach is limited. So
Mm-hmm.
when MassMutual reached out to me to say they actually think this is a huge opportunity for the industry, it actually gave me access to work with their field resources that are over 300 people that can work with great advisors such as yourself. And the other beauty is MassMutual is a mutual insurance company. They're not public.
Mm-hmm.
So they have invested in Viability so that we can actually work with your firm to run this analysis, and there's no cost to you as the advisor, and there's no cost to the employer, regardless of the plan being at MassMutual or not. And that really is something very unique about a MassMutual buying Viability. As a mutual, they're very interested in how does this affect every American, not necessarily the direct result to their financial statement.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, MassMutual is very unique in the industry being in that position.
Yeah, definitely. So just kind of to break it all down, I guess, what is really like for employers with what you're doing? What is their kind of main benefit? And then for the employees, what is the takeaway for, like, why should either party care, really?
Yeah, and you know, I've been doing this for about 30 years in employee benefits, and I always say this, and it's really true, as somebody that never intended to be in financial services, being a psych major.
Mm-hmm.
But what I would give you as an observation is when you have two constituencies, such as an employer, so think about it, as an employer, as a CFO, your main job is to make sure the organization exists and employ these people, right? That's kind of your stewardship responsibility. And for an employee, your main responsibility is to have a job that allows you to provide and protect your family.
Mm-hmm.
So anytime in my 30 years that we actually create the perfect alignment between those sets of needs, really, really good things happen for both parties. And that's what we're doing with Viability and working with great advisors and engaging with great employers, is we actually are showing them that this financial wellness, retirement readiness that everybody talks about, which is right on for the employee, is actually perfectly aligned with what is going to make the best companies, organizations live into the future, because they're dealing with the largest expenses in their financial statement, which are wage, healthcare, workers' comp. The other beauty, which is less concrete, but concrete all the same, is when you have that alignment, you actually improve productivity, presenteeism, morale of your organization. So there's really not a downfall in aligning the needs of an employer and an employee.
Yeah, and I mean, you come at it, it sounds like, from a very, like, holistic approach. I feel like a lot of people probably hear about what you do and think it's only kind of tied to their retirement plan, but, I mean, that's not true, really.
No, I as somebody that's had a lot of life experiences, really good ones and some really bad ones, there is a very limited benefit dollar to be spent. So something MassMutual is very committed to, and as part of MassMutual I'm very committed to, is actually how do you spend that limited benefit dollar?
Mm-hmm.
There are certain parts of any employer's population, and I know this is heresy in the retirement industry to say this, where retirement shouldn't be their number 2, number 3 priority. Social Security is actually a pretty good income replacement vehicle on the lower side of the wage base.
Mm-hmm.
So making sure that they can afford the deductible on the high deductible plan, or making sure they have some basic life insurance or catastrophic care insurance, probably is actually a better utilization of that limited dollar than necessarily recommending to that employee to put 10% into their 401k plan.
Yeah.
And that's something we're very committed to and working on every day. Our programs that help the advisor, help the sponsor, but most specifically help the employee to allocate that limited benefit dollar in the most precise way possible.
Yeah, I mean, I think even though we are retirement plan advisors, we sort of probably see eye to eye on this more than you would think, just because
Sure.
obviously we want people to save for retirement and, have enough to live when they're not working anymore, but we
Sure.
have a strong emphasis on meeting with people one-on-one and, understanding their kind of whole financial picture, as opposed to just like, oh, why aren't you maxing out your 401k? You should just do that. Like, it's obviously not that easy for most people. So, yeah, I mean, we definitely think that, taking the whole picture into account is very important, which is, I think, basically what you're saying.
That is what I'm saying.
You
said it better, but that is what I'm saying.
I feel like what you're doing is very unique to the industry right now. So I don't know if you can just kind of speak on, where you see this going and kind of how it works alongside other trends like financial wellness programs being implemented more, or, anything kind of in the bigger scheme of things.
Yeah, so the number one thing that MassMutual purchasing what I built has allowed me to do is just really speak around the country. The reception from both the sponsor, the advisor, consulting community has been amazing. That really puts the program into a position where I would say it's more like a Wikipedia program. Every time we implement it, we learn, the industry learns, and we share that learning with everybody that's engaged in the program.
Mm-hmm.
So, we have seen employers really build this into their risk management programs. So people that are financially not well are actually distracted. So we actually have a trucking company that now uses loan and hardships as a leading indicator to distracted drivers.
Mm-hmm.
And each truck accident costs $500,000. So they swat in financial professionals to work with that driver on whatever they needed to take the loan and hardship to solve for. So that's really my favorite part of this, is we learn every single day. We've yet to have a bad conversation around, if you would, this human capital management idea.
Mm-hmm.
And it really just expands the breadth and depth of what a retirement plan is there for, which is really to help an employer control the demographic trend or aging of their population in a way that's very humanistic, and saying to older employees, if you still want to be here, we want you to be here, and you're well worth the marginal difference in cost. But if you really would like to leave the workplace, we're going to work really hard with you through our advisor to change your funded status and the way you're approaching investments so that you don't become a financially trapped employee. And it's just taken off. It's really exciting.
It obviously sounds like you're doing a lot of great work, but I'm sure, you face pushback maybe, or any sort of challenges kind of communicating with people, because I feel like what you're doing is very, like, you have to look at the long-term ramifications, and I feel like sometimes that is difficult for people in general, but especially, CFOs or people who kind of have to be focused on, like, the bottom line, or, like, what is going to happen next quarter, and, like, that's kind of all they're focused on. How do you kind of get past that?
Yeah, it's a great question. What I would say to you is, and I forgot to say this, so I'm glad you asked the question. Everything we propose initially does not cost the employer any additional money. So if you think about it, if we had a scenario where an employer matches 50 cents on every dollar to 4% of pay,
mm-hmm.
we would tell the advisor, if you're going to do auto enrollment, you're going to want to say, but we can do this at 25 cents on every dollar up to 6% of pay. Now, whether that ends up being a result or not, what you want to do is show the CFO there is a way to drastically increase employee funding, which is in the employee's best interest, but it also, you can do it in a way that does not increase employer costs, but drastically reduces employer liability. So any of your initial discussions or scenarios that you'd run out through the Reveal Viability program reporting, we make sure that the advisor is not suggesting an increase in employer costs. Once the CFO understands the return on investment solely through employee funding, now they'll be open to discuss whether they want to actually increase in a nominal way the employer cost. Hopefully that makes sense to you, but that's very important what you just raised.
Yeah.
Is we can absolutely show a reduction in employer liability solely through increased employee funding.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel like just the whole liability thing that you keep talking about is not really something people think about in terms of like financial wellness or like helping their employees save for retirement. I don't think they see it necessarily as like a liability if it's not,
right.
You know.
Well, I don't think the industry up to now has done a really good job helping the employer look at their own data, which is key.
Yeah.
And showing them the results of a demographic trend and how that affects their financial statement due to the increase in wage, healthcare, workers' comp, and other expenses. So we've kind of rushed in with the solution without actually diagnosing the problem. And if you went to a doctor and they started prescribing you medicine and they never did a blood test, you would think the doctor was a bit of a quack too.
That's true.
You know, so I would say, you know, I really don't blame the CFO. I think they're very logical people. We just kind of had a blind spot thinking, you know, that our passion around all the answers without really showing them what we were solving for was a good idea. And I think we just need to slow down a little bit and make sure the CFO can come on the journey with us.
When you're starting this process with a client, kind of where do you begin? How do you kind of start? Do they come to you with like a problem area or kind of just what's the process at the beginning stages?
Yeah, the process is really for the advisory group, in this case, you all, to just sit down with, I have a one-page example that's non-specific to the employer that really conceptually just shows how the lack of readiness ties in with the marginal difference in cost between an older worker and somebody that could replace them if they were ready to retire, how those create the liability, and then there are techniques to mitigate it. And to ask that employer, is this something you would like to take a look at? Now, remember, it's free to look at their data. So we have yet to have a CFO or an HR person say, yeah, I would hate to see the metric into my own data. So we find they're very receptive to look at their data. And then once you have their data and you start to work with them, it opens up all sorts of consulting opportunities around the dilemma they're facing and what are the potential solutions to that dilemma.
So I think just to kind of close out, I just kind of wanted to get your thoughts on, you know, what do you think employers should really be focusing on in terms of their benefits right now? Like what do you see as like the most important just like trend or like what should be their priority?
I think, you know, once again, that's why they're great advisors to actually know each client individually. But I would say the three things that we have decided we're going to focus on is why should the CFO care, right? So make sure there's actually a reason that human capital they care about human capital management, by the way. These are huge expense items to their financial statement. But how does retirement actually fit into the rest of their benefits? And how having a healthy, financially well staff ties in. So why should they care would be number one. Number two, we're looking very hard at when that employee gets the 3 enrollment kits, health and welfare, life, DI, dental, vision, their voluntary risk-based benefits, and then their retirement kit. How does a normal American make heads or tails on how to spend that limited benefit dollar? And Mass Mutual has actually worked on a very, very progressive program to help the advisor, the employer, help their employees to make that critical decision. And then the last piece is, how do you actually administer that decision by those employees? We see those as 3 questions we find every employer has is, how do I prove the return on investment on the benefits? How do my poor employees actually execute on all of these benefits we're offering? And number 3, as an employer, due to the choice that we're offering in benefits, how do we actually execute administratively? Those kind of are the 3 big areas we're focused on.
Yeah, I feel like return on investment for this type of thing is just like very key.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which I mean is pretty much like a service that you provide, which is awesome.
Yeah, I don't, just to be clear, I only provide it through you though. We do not work directly with the sponsor.
Okay. Thanks for clearing that up. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to me today.
Totally my pleasure.